express any point of view you want.
Nazi.
Shut up a minute.
No, I won't.
And
some people were pro-Nazi, and the answer is that they were well treated by people who ostracized them, and I'm for ostracizing people who egg on other people to shoot American Marines and American soldiers. I know you don't care.
As far as I'm concerned, the only sort of pro or crypto-Nazi I can think of is yourself. Failing that, I would only say that we can't have.
Now listen, you
the right of assembly.
Stop calling me a crypto-Nazi.
Let's stop calling names.
You in your goddamn face, and you'll stay plastered.
Gentlemen, let's...
Oh, Bill.
Let the author Myra Bracken...
Show, we began with a famous argument between right-wing intellectual William F. Buckley and novelist Gore Vidal at the 1968 Republican National Convention in Miami. Vidal called Buckley a crypto-Nazi, and Buckley, if you're listening carefully, responded by calling Vidal a queer and threatening to hit him. Neil is off this week doing super secret stuff. All will be revealed eventually. But today, I am delighted to offer an episode featuring former New York Times journalist Sam Tanenhaus, the author of 2 previous books on conservatism in the United States, including a biography of anti-communist Whittaker Chambers. Sam joined me to talk about his new volume about a man who did more than almost anyone else to move the Republican Party to the right. So join Sam and me in a conversation about Buckley, the life and the revolution that changed America. I'm Claire Potter. This is the Political Junkie Podcast, and this is this week's episode, The Right Stuff. And that's it. Welcome to the Political Junkie Podcast. I am delighted to be here today with Sam Tanenhaus. Sam, welcome to the show.
Claire, good to be with you. It already feels like fun.
I know. Well, Sam, your biography of William F. Buckley was so engrossing that I just knew I had to talk to you about it. But where I want to start was, it struck me immediately that this biography is in fact a prehistory in so many ways to the moment we're in, but you couldn't have known that when you began it. So could you talk about why you lit on William F. Buckley as your subject?
Well, you're absolutely right, Claire, and this will be a surprise, even to more mature viewers and listeners. The contract for this book was signed in 1998. It was a different world, and I was just then beginning, as it happened, a pretty busy professional life in journalism, so it got put on hold. But at the time I was first writing about it was after I had written and had published a book of Whittaker Chambers, this kind of interesting Cold War figure. I thought this was going to be about the rise, the triumph of the political right. Now, I don't belong to the right, but I'm an observer of it. We all know this. When we write biographies, you're interested in the other. You know, there's this new podcast around, you probably know, that I've been on called Know Your Enemy. And that's kind of the idea, who are these people? What are they doing? And I'd gotten to know Buckley while I was doing the previous book. And I thought, this is a really interesting man, Bill Buckley, because he's larger than his ideology. He's more generous, he's more capacious, he's funny. All his friends are on the left, they're all literary people. His wife is this giantess who dominated New York social life, Manhattan social life. So this is a rich subject. Well, then, at that moment, it looked like he really had won. You had the Reagan victory in 1980, followed in 84. And Reagan had been a kind of disciple of Buckley's. Then another one of Buckley's sort of old boy network friends, George H.W. Bush, was elected president. And then the next one, Bill Clinton, seemed to be accepting that this is where politics was going, a kind of, we now call neoliberalism, globalist politics, free markets, and all the rest. And then the earthquake came, and we saw this eruption come from what looked like the fringe right. And Buckley was familiar with some of this. They called it the new right back in his day, just as they do again. I think I've experienced 3 new rights in my lifetime. Buckley lived until the year 2008, died at the age of 82 in February 2008. And that was when I really began work on the book, because you're writing about yourself. It's pretty tough when your subject is there staring you in the face. You have to get some distance. And then, of course, the politics changed. And I thought, Well, all right, so Barack Obama had won, and Buckley didn't live long enough to see Obama elected, but I had the feeling he would like him. He'd like his style, his verbal command. Obama's a very good writer, very good speaker. Buckley would get all of that, a lot of personal style and grace. You know, Buckley politically was opposed to Jack Kennedy, JFK, but he really admired him as a person. And Obama, for those of us who can cast our minds back that far, really seemed like the next JFK. He had that same kind of charismatic aura. So I thought, well, this is an interesting moment to start in again with Buckley. And then, of course, we got the real earthquake in 2016. And that with Trump's victory, and that coincided. It's one of these fortuitous things when you're working these books with, at my wife's suggestion, pulling my nose out of the immense Buckley archive. Bill Buckley's archive at Yale is the size of a presidential archive. The man got 600 letters a week and answered every single one of them. That's how you build a movement. Or he had his secretaries or somebody do it. But anyway, an enormous correspondence. And Kathy said, get out of the art. You can't write a book in one archive. So we went down to Camden, South Carolina, where his family, when he was growing up in the 1930s and 40s, had also lived. There I found the segregationist history of the Buckley family, and I'm finding that out at the same time the politics is changing, and lo and behold, I'm in the midst of really working through the manuscript. We have the George Floyd moment and the transformation of racial politics again in America, and I thought, I am telling a very different story from the one I thought. And one thing we do in these books, you know this very well, is we're writing about the past, but we're seeing it from our own moment. And it's not to distort, it's not to corrupt, it's not to twist it into a presentist idea of the past, but rather we now have new equipment, right? We have new lenses to hold up to the past, and things began looking very different. And that's how we got where we are now with this book.
Yeah. And one of the things that I really enjoyed about the book is that you present Buckley as a man of ideas, but also a man of impulses. And that those impulses are really ingrained in the family he grew up in. His father, who is a speculator, shall we say a wildcatter, who makes millions and millions of dollars, loses millions and millions of dollars. But you also very deftly show that this adventuresome quality in this man is linked to a sort of profound reactionary point of view that trickles down to his children. And I believe it's on page 23.
Oh boy.
You leave poor little Billy Buckley weeping at home as his older brothers and sisters run off to burn a cross on the lawn of a hotel that has just been purchased by a Jewish family. That moment, you really got my attention. So can you talk about your strategy of both presenting Buckley as a man who was very open to ideas, would have liked an Obama, and yet really became the symbol of a reactionary anti-Semitism, anti-civil rights, anti-queer, and we'll get back to the queer stuff in a minute.
Yeah, we will.
How did you put those puzzle pieces together?
Well, in some way, Claire, you never do. Because you think of a person as being whole and complete in some ways, but we're also kind of fractured, I think, in others. Mm-hmm. And I was asked the other day when I did at a bookstore in Oxford, Mississippi, a wonderful bookstore down there, and someone asked me, he asked me about one of the epigraphs in the book, which comes from Proust's great first novel, Swann's Way, about how something you said, Claire, at the very beginning. I'm really glad you used the word impulse. Buckley was primarily a man of feeling. And what I began to realize is, for those of your listeners who remember him, the enormous vocabulary and rococo syntax and the complex styles of argument, all that is a kind of mask or even camouflage. In his own time, it was called a smokescreen. for very powerful surges of feeling. And this is what Proust writes about in this extraordinary epigraph I draw on, that our beliefs do not originate in the facts that are given to us. They originate in what we feel. That means no quantity of facts, no huge volume of facts will ever change what we really feel. We can become older and wiser and more sympathetic, as Buckley did. A better listener. He became a really good listener. And he met people face to face and began to develop a more humane worldview. But the feelings stayed the same. And you're right, they came from this extraordinary father, William F. Buckley Sr. Bill was the 6th of 10 children, so he was in the middle, the 3rd or 4th sons, very much like Robert F. Kennedy, who was also the 3rd or 4th sons, and intense in the way Robert Kennedy was. Jack had this kind of, savoir-faire. Robert Kennedy didn't. He was the believing Catholic, as Buckley was really devoutly Catholic. And that's another aspect of it too, Claire, is yes, they are a family of blasphemers in one sense. They're offending all their neighbors up there in the northwest corner of Connecticut, as it's called, at the same time that they're devoutly going to church on Sunday, taking the servants, including people of color, in the cars with them to go to church, because that's how Catholics did it in those days. And one answer to the question, Claire, is how he could balance these different sides of himself came from a remark one of his friends made in the early 90s. He said, Bill Buckley is not a conservative. He's a Spanish aristocrat. His idea of Catholicism is the Catholicism of the Counter-Reformation. His father made and lost his first fortune in Mexico. He had could see the architect's design for the Palacio he was going to build for his children. He was going to raise them as expatriates in Mexico City until the revolution came. And so the father and children became counter-revolutionaries with the same idea. They're going to restore a high Catholicism, a hierarchical caste society, all the rest. Those values are strangely kind of un-American. I think Louis Menand, when he wrote about my book, said there's something un-American about Buckley, and in some ways he's right. He'd almost have a continental sort of figure. So it made him really exotic in his own time. And he still is. Lots of young people I've met go on YouTube and watch the famous firing line debates. Buckley and Noam Chomsky, or Buckley and Allen Ginsberg, and Muhammad Ali. And it's the kind of aristocratic auteur that he had, and also a sense of humor and wit that made it all possible. That's why when we hear and see Buckley-style politics now, it has a much rougher edge than it did when he practiced it.
Yeah, my first encounters with William F. Buckley were that my grandfather, who was Anglo-Canadian, watched Firing Line. And my grandfather was a tremendous Anglophile, still referred to whoever was the monarch of England at the time as my king or my queen, and so on. And he was devoted to Buckley for all the reasons you're saying. But one of the things that's very interesting about Buckley is that on the one hand, he's a reactionary, he's very conservative, and on the other hand, he has his finger on the pulse of change. He understands, for example, that if there's only one conservative magazine, Human Events, there's room for another one, and that you can get ideas to people. He understands that television, early on, is a vehicle for getting his ideas to people, and that furthermore, you want to engage everybody. You don't just want to speak to conservatives. How does he become that person?
Well, it's partly, Claire, because he was surrounded by liberals. And when I talk to young people, they're amazed to learn, really young people, like campus conservatives, who are fascinated by the idea of Buckley. They're amazed to learn that National Review was a radical magazine when it started in 1955. Buckley called himself a radical conservative because when they read it, even if they have the historical interest to read the early issues, it kind of sounds like the liberal magazines. That language is elevated. It's a lot of sly humor and wit. There's this idea in it that people in the arts are somehow superior to political people, things you would never hear from the right today. Well, that's the environment Buckley grew up in. When he and his siblings were raised in Sharon, Connecticut, and you know very well where that is. You're up there in Northampton. It's very close to one of his sisters. Several of his sisters went to Smith. I think 4 of them. It's that same part of the universe, that kind of Berkshire America. Well, when the Buckleys were raised to hate the traitor to their class, Franklin Roosevelt, he's the guy they saw at the horse show every summer in Rhinebeck. So it's a very small community, a small world. Even when Buckley was battling with Gore Vidal, they were calling each other by their first names in correspondence, I found. Up until that moment, they all knew each other. But it was a world dominated by liberals. So Buckley thought you have to beat them at their own game. You have to be taken seriously by liberals to make any progress. You have to be a conservative who flourishes in a world where you're really outnumbered, and either you can shout into the darkness or you can try to bring them over to your side. And that's what he strategically thought was the thing to do.
Well, it's interesting because I was reading this book during the period in which Charlie Kirk was assassinated, and somebody I hadn't actually paid a lot of attention to was suddenly in the news all the time. And I realized how many of the things that Charlie Kirk did had really been pioneered by Buckley. Organizing students on campus, the idea that debate is a way to get your ideas out there. The big difference between the two of them, other than the fact that Buckley was very upper class and Ivy League educated and so on, and Charlie Kirk was none of those things, was that Charlie Kirk also said the quiet part out loud all the time. And his supporters don't like to admit that, but we have him on tape saying all kinds of dreadful things about people of color, about women, about queer people. For Buckley, those were things you said at home, perhaps. But except for one extraordinary incident that I want to talk about, he didn't say them out loud.
If you read the memoir by his son Christopher Buckley, have you read this, Losing Mom and Pop?
No, I have not.
He has pages on the gay friends who populated the Buckley household. That's what was shocking to them when Buckley not only tangled with Vidal, but later when he wrote that notorious op-ed piece in the Times about tattooing gay men during the AIDS crisis, which Buckley insisted he was doing because he wanted to save lives. Well, maybe he did, but that might not be the way to go about it. But friends of his showed me correspondence. They said to him, Bill, how could you do this? In Gstaad, where Bill and Pat Buckley reigned over the social scene, it's gay designers and gay painters and composers. That was the world they lived in. And it was agreed upon that you didn't talk about these things. That was also, that fit into the libertarian argument. You leave people alone. That's why so many of the Jews early in the movement, like Frank Meyer, were libertarian, because they thought, well, I mean, not that Frank himself wasn't gay, but others like Marvin Liebman is a much better example. Here's a gay man who is Jewish, is pulled into the movement, partly because he'll be left alone. Or Meyer is a Jew, thinks, well, I'll be left alone. And that Bill Rusher, the publisher of National Review, was gay. The idea was that we won't intrude. We won't intrude on your private life. And that's why what Vidal did, I think, Gore Vidal, was very cleverly, he thought Buckley was trying to pull a fast one, and he kept pushing the buttons until he was able to get the response from Buckley and humiliate him. I mean, Buckley was ashamed of that exchange for the rest of his life. Gore was kind of triumphant about it. He thought he'd exposed Buckley, and very possibly he had. But it also shows you, I think, the ambiguity and complexity about Buckley and his sexuality, other conservatives and their sexuality. And I think it's something that's still with us. I'll add one other difference. You pointed quite precisely to a difference between Charlie Kirk and Bill Buckley. Here's another one. When Buckley visited campuses a lot, about the same age Charlie Kirk was, early 30s, he debated professors. Mm-hmm. He didn't goad students in one-on-ones. He said, show me the smartest professor you've got. Right. Give me the chairman of the English department, and we'll go on stage, and we'll see who does better with foreign languages. Now, he wanted to carry the battle sort of on that stage, on that arena, and I began to notice over time, that's what some of the last part of the book is about, how suddenly you're not fighting to preserve Yale in whatever form Buckley thought it should be done, but actually to tear it down, which is the place we've reached now. And that was a transformation that began to happen in his lifetime that he was highly uncomfortable with.
It's very interesting. And I'm also thinking, and listeners, I want to say the incident of Gore Vidal and needling Buckley until Buckley responded by calling him a queer. That happens at the 1968 Republican National Convention, where the two have been deliberately put together by the network to argue with each other. Gore Vidal refers to Buckley over and over again as a Nazi, and that is what pushes Buckley over the edge. And he is humiliated by it. But there are other moments in which we see Buckley changing because of these conflicts. And I want to point to the debate he does with James Baldwin at the Oxford Union. And Baldwin wins. He convinces a large room full of white upper-class English people that the civil rights movement is something to be taken seriously and that it is bending the arc of the world toward social justice. And Buckley is sort of set back on his heels by that, because up until that moment, he has really been a diehard segregationist and the ally of segregationists. Strom Thurmond is one of his big political allies. So we also see Buckley changing. Did you see other moments of transformation in which Buckley is rethinking his principles?
Yes, and that's the most important, has to do with race. And that was one that was happened steadily. People are surprised when they learn that debate was in 1965. Buckley and National Review still opposed the Civil Rights Act. They opposed the Voting Rights Act after it was passed. 5 years later, Buckley says, well, maybe what we need is a black president. You think, well, how does someone make that transformation? Well, it's partly because on his television show, Firing Line, he started bringing all these guests on. He was, a lot of them leaders in the civil rights movement, some of them Black Panthers, radicals and militants. And he's interested in them. He wants to hear what they have to say. Made a tour of inner cities in 1969 and was really impressed by community organizers, in particular Jesse Jackson. So that's the most important of those transformations. The other one that happened, Claire, that I think was really important, happened in kind of a negative way, although it was good for him and good for us. And that is the first Republican president, true blue, die-hard Republican president, elected in Buckley's mature life was, believe it or not, Richard Nixon.
Right.
Dwight Eisenhower was elected in the 50s, but no one even knew what his politics were. The Democrats had tried to recruit him to run in 1948.
He had never voted before he was nominated.
Sure, he's
for
a
president.
military man. You stay away from politics.
Yeah.
As it happens, he was quite conservative, but he was not a part of the conservative movement by any means that Buckley founded. And in fact, Buckley and company kept denouncing him year after year. Well, then finally, a lifelong professional politician, Richard Nixon, is elected president. He turns out to be a total criminal. And Buckley was working for him. So Nixon brings Buckley in because he needs Buckley to protect his flank on the right. Nixon really comes out of a kind of Earl Warren, Thomas Dewey, centrist republicanism, establishment republicanism. And Buckley and company don't trust him. But when Nixon asks Buckley to help him by sitting on the board of the United States Information Agency, and also Buckley at this point is a powerful syndicated columnist. We don't think of columnists today having the influence that they really did back then, when a Walter Lippmann or a James Reston, was often said to be more influential than the member of cabinet. Get on the phone with the president, tell them what to think. And this is what Buckley was doing. His friend Henry Kissinger is whining and dining him and calling him, summoning him up down to the White House on the private plane and all this stuff. And Buckley's very good friend, his former handler in the CIA, E. Howard Hunt, turns out to be the lead felon in the Watergate burglary and spills everything to Buckley, tells him many of the crimes that were committed. And Buckley didn't know what to do about it, felt loyal to his friend Howard, but he also knew Nixon was a criminal. And those next few years, in my telling of the story, those became really crucial. To my mind, they almost became the undoing of Buckley, because he felt he'd compromised his autonomy and independence. He was so proud of that aristocratic way of, Louis Armstrong, no one tells me how to play the song. Buckley would say whatever he thought, write whatever he felt, and that meant no one could influence him, no matter how close he was to the establishment. Now he's inside the establishment, sees the establishment is corrupt, really doesn't know what to do, but what that did, the good thing it did, was make him realize the institutions of the government were more important than any individuals who were, ensconced in them at any given moment. A lesson some of us could stand to learn right now. So Buckley realizes he's not a radical anymore. He's kind of a constitutional conservative Republican. The president gets out of line. We don't want that president anymore. And he starts realizing the extremists won't help the party or the movement. Another example I probably should have mentioned first, Claire, that you may be thinking of, is when after some soul-searching and agonizing, Buckley denounced the John Birch Society, which is really kind of the pre-MAGA of his time, and just said, we can't have the kooks and conspiracy freaks running the show. If they want to go out and vote for our guys, that's fine, but they can't be in charge. And that was a really important decision he made that cost him, seems so obvious today, but it cost them hundreds of subscriptions for a small magazine, antagonized many people on the right who still despise him for it. They think that Buckley was pulling social rank on Robert Welch, the leader of the John Birch Society, or was dismissing these people as kind of roughnecks and the hoi polloi, the rabblement that didn't belong in his sophisticated movement. And now we look at those things and say, well, no, he's just using his common sense.
Right.
You have to draw the line somewhere.
Well, and he also sort of does it in this somewhat underhanded way in which he denounces the society and then writes to Robert Welch and says, of course, this isn't about you. I'm not denouncing you. It's just all the people who surround you. And Robert Welch at least has enough sense to say, oh, that is ridiculous. Yeah. No, we are not friends anymore. But, it's also true that post-Nixon, there is another right that is in the ascendant. They are not Buckley's people, the Richard Vigarys, the Paul Wyricks, the working class kids who came up through college Republicans and young Republicans and, a whole parallel network of them. And they are behind Reagan. And yet when Reagan gets into office, he sort of pushes aside everybody who has helped him get there, including Buckley, correct?
Including Buckley. To me, and I think to Buckley, and we should say, Claire, I don't know if we've talked about this, but I was Buckley's chosen biographer. I spent so many hours with him because, there were 10 years when I saw him a lot, before he died. And actually, it went back sooner when I was writing about Whittaker Chambers. I first met him in 1990. So I knew him for close to 30 years. And comfortable with the sort of people he would not want in his house. Look, his wife, Pat, felt that way about me. I was never invited to social events. I don't move in those circles, and I understood it. But Buckley really wanted to think he could out-argue, out-reason the opposition. Once the impulses that we talked about before overtake everything, when they closed the circuits of reasoning down, then he got nervous. With Reagan, he was charismatic politician, enormous political gifts, and everybody in the right saw this, and Reagan cultivated Buckley. Reagan was not especially learned in conservative doctrine, and when he started out, he was kind of flirting with the Birchers in California. That was the real stronghold for that movement, as we know, Orange County and elsewhere in Southern California. And Reagan was gathering that support to get elected governor with Buckley's help. But as he got closer to being elected president, first with a remarkable defeat when he challenged the incumbent Gerald Ford in 1976. I thought Buckley, by the way, handled that with great aplomb. He wants Reagan to win, but he does not want Reagan to be too much the extremist. He doesn't want him playing to the mob. He wants him instead to be the kind of heroic anti-communist voice of freedom that Buckley's hero Whittaker Chambers had been. And he does as well as he can to steer Reagan in the right direction. Reagan finally gets elected in 1980. He instantly drops Buckley. And Buckley didn't realize how shrewd and pragmatic a figure Reagan was. And Buckley all along was being needled by some, either in the center or as being a kook, or on the right as being a snob. There's all the questions about Buckley, and Reagan very shrewdly assessed it. He did not need Buckley the way Richard Nixon did. Reagan won in a landslide, and the right is there with him. Buckley doesn't really have a role any longer. He's a friend. He's fun to have in the White House. All those social graces that the Reagans liked almost worked to Buckley's detriment, because they made him and his wife social ornaments rather than political allies. And Buckley was really stung by that, more so than he let on at the time.
Right. Just to pivot a little bit, I want to make sure we talk about Pat Buckley before we go, because she is a figure who comes in and out of the book. This is, listeners, this is a 900-page book. So if Sam left some things out that I would have liked there, I forgive him. But I wanted to know more about her. It sort of seems like she agrees to marry him in this businesslike moment where, you know, she's playing cards or something like that, and he's pacing in the hall and says, I've got to speak to you. And she comes up and says, you know, I know what you're going to say. And the answer is yes. Now can I get back to my card game?
I know.
And she brings a lot of money into the relationship. She then inherits a lot of money. Money is a big issue for Buckleys. They get a lot of it. They spend a lot of it. They don't necessarily keep track of it. Buckley is pouring money into his projects. I'm not sure National Review has ever made any money. Maybe it has now that it's online. But Pat is sort of a somewhat more shadowy figure. Can you tell us a little bit more about what she got from this marriage?
Well, it was a fascinating relationship, and my wife and I saw the two of them on numerous occasions when we would be invited to their house in Stamford, not to Manhattan where the salons were, but their weekend home. We lived in Westchester County, and they were about 40 minutes away, Stamford, Connecticut. She was a really imperious figure, a very sharp, biting wit, and Bill was introduced to her by his sister, Patricia Trish Buckley Bozell. She married Buckley's best friend, Brent Bozell, and introduced Buckley to her suite mate at Vassar, Patricia Taylor, who was from Vancouver, one of the wealthiest families in Vancouver, far wealthier than the Buckleys. Her father was the mirror image of Buckley's father. Her father built companies and enlarged them, or he acquired failing companies and made them better. Whereas Buckley's father was a real buccaneer. He'd start something up and get bored and move on to the next one, a little bit like Buckley himself. Whereas her father, Austin Taylor, was a giant. They called him one of the Knights of Commerce in Canada, and very Anglican. Buckleys are Catholic, and, in their part of the world, that puts them a little on the margins. The Taylors were true blue, devoted Anglicans, and probably a little bit like your grandfather. Mm-hmm. Loyal to the king. The Austin Taylor had been awarded one of the OBE or something for helping England pay out of his own pocket during the Second World War and all the rest. And Pat inherited a lot of those attitudes. So she was on the right, but she was kind of a royalist right-winger. And Buckley's friends seemed kind of scruffy to her. They were sort of, brilliant writer types like Gary Wills and John Leonard, or Arlene Croce, the dance critic, told me that she went over to Buckley's apartment, the first apartment they had on 69th Street before they bought that magnificent maisonette. And she said, I didn't put this in the book, so this may interest you. She was in the kitchen table, they were sitting in the kitchen table, and Pat Buckley walks in with half a dozen shirts and has Bill try them on. And Arlene Croce, and you know her, the great and very prickly dance critic, who did not give many interviews, but she gave me one because she loved Buckley so much. And she said, well, I thought, what's she doing with these shirts? And why is she intruding on him? And then she thought, She said, I realized that's the only time she's going to get him to sit still long enough to be dressed, clothed decently. So that was part of her role. She liked the idea of being the society matron. On the other hand, she had this sharp, biting wit, and you can see the best of Pat Buckley in their son Christopher in his Washington novels. There's also not as much on him as I would have liked to have in the book, Christopher, but he made it clear. He said, this book is about my father, it's not about Christopher. He wrote those very clever satires of Washington political life, published in the 80s and the 2000s, that were the best of their kind. And they had kind of a combination of, P.G. Wodehouse and Henry Adams writing about Washington. And Pat Buckley had some of that imperious style, too. An important thing about her, as you know very well, is at the crucial moment in the AIDS crisis, when Bill Buckley, let's be honest here, was embarrassing himself and not helping his own friends,
right,
who were very much aware of the epidemic. It was Pat Buckley who was raising funds for them, who was and organizing brigades of women to support gay men and research into AIDS. Mitch Decter, remember her? You probably know her.
I do, yes.
Yeah. She told me early on, she said, do not underestimate Pat Buckley. At a critical moment, she gave Bill respectability in Manhattan culture because of her ties to that broader sort of stratum, of the elite in Manhattan society, which was so important to them. But also there was more heart in it, more empathy and sympathy, which Bill really needed to learn.
It's really interesting. And, one of the things I noticed, and I don't expect you to reveal anything here, but that in a family of 10 siblings, there were actually 11 and one died, and then all of Buckley's siblings have lots and lots of children, as upper-class Catholics did then. They have one child. And there are lots of reasons why people just have one child, but it makes for a very different life for them than the one he grew up in or the one that his siblings are cultivating. And it seems like a smaller world, one in which he has more freedom, fewer responsibilities to family, even though he, in fact, takes responsibility for other people's families and sends children to college and pays their boarding school fees and so on when their parents are in trouble, but that he got to choose himself over and over and over again. Is that wrong?
That's very interesting. Well, he wanted to be a real paterfamilias, and his very good friend Alistair Horn told me he thought that was Bill's biggest disappointment, that he wanted to be like his father, have many children. Pat couldn't have them. She had serious miscarriages. And I should have included more of that, something on that in the book. That's an oversight.
Very personal.
Very personal. And it also, and this is interesting, I'll tell you this, I haven't talked about this much, but you've asked about her, so I'll tell you. She was not a fan of Buckley's siblings, in particular some of the sisters with their 6 and 8 and 10 children. And she thought they were trying to they wanted her to be different from who she was. She was very independent-minded. And if you look at some of the family writings, you see these comments about Pat's hair. What's Pat's hair going to look like next time? She was stylish. She created her own life in Manhattan, if you think about it. She comes from Vancouver. Well, it was a famous family in Vancouver, but nobody had ever heard of them in New York. She created all of that herself and maintained it herself. Now, I'm surprised you didn't mention one other Buckley sister, Priscilla. What did you make of her?
Well, I thought she was very interesting. And I think what you're saying about the family being a kind of corporation, one can imagine Pat sort of taking a look at this and saying, I'm not doing it. But I thought Priscilla was very interesting because she is someone who 20 years later probably would have been running for office herself or would have been secretary of something or other. And instead, she funneled her talent and energy and education into promoting her brother's project. What I actually thought was more interesting is that the level of respect for siblings that was bred in that family meant that Buckley seems to have responded to his sisters as intellectuals, not as lesser beings because they were women. So that was my impression.
It's all true. When I interviewed his older brother, James Buckley, who lived the longest of all the siblings, became a senator from New York and then a federal judge. And I said, well, you and Bill, you got interested in journalism. And he said, well, our sisters were great journalists, so we wanted to do it too. Right. There was a kind of equality among the Buckleys you didn't find among the Kennedys. I'm sure you noticed this. The Buckley sisters went to 7 sister schools. They didn't go to convent colleges. Even though they were raised to be Catholic mothers and wives, they went to Smith. And the one who went to Vassar instead of Smith did so because of a family scandal that kept her out of Smith. So she went to Vassar instead, where she met Pat Taylor. But they were Phi Beta Kappa students. Priscilla Buckley was one of the great line editors, text editors of her time.
Right.
John Leonard, the great literary journalist, at one point said, Bill Buckley taught me how to fly a kite. Priscilla Buckley taught me how to fly a sentence. She was Gary Wills's editor. She was Joan Didion's editor. Wow. And I wonder what you make of the fact that Priscilla was the one sibling who did not marry at all.
Right.
What do you think of that?
Well, one does wonder, just as one wonders if Bill Buckley was quite as heterosexual as he purported to be. Not that there's anything wrong with that, as Jerry Seinfeld would say, but I did have the sense that there were secrets in the family that to this day have not been revealed. Yes.
Well, she was a great golfer. That's all I'll say. She was a great hunter. She was a great hunter and a great golfer.
Yeah. And she went to Smith, right?
She went to Smith. Yeah,
okay.
even before it became the Smith we know. The other sister who was fascinating because tormented, and all the siblings agreed was the most talented member of the family, was the eldest, Eloise Buckley, who went off to Smith. And your listeners will be interested to know, I'm sure you probably knew it, but most of them don't. Their great friend at Smith was Betty Friedan, who was not Friedan back in those days. They were all doing the newspaper together. And there's a great moment when Buckley had Betty Friedan on firing line after some years after the Feminine Mystique had been published, when Now was formed, and Buckley was always interested in these movements. And you see, as the show's beginning, Betty Friedan whispers to Buckley, and Buckley's eyebrows go up in that famous way. And when Betty Friedan answers the first question, Buckley just lets her go on and on. And the reason is that she told him right before they started taping that she, Betty Friedan, had saved his 2 sisters from being expelled from Smith because of a prank they all did, exposing anti-Semitism at Smith, something the family should have been proud of, that in that weird Buckley world, they kept secret, and Buckley never knew it. Betty Friedan, shrewd and strategic herself, dropped that bomb on Buckley right before they interviewed one another. And if you go back if you dig through National Review, which you can do online if you do it through EBSCO or one of those forms, and you start looking for Betty Friedan, you'll see her name comes up and things Priscilla wrote, and it's always very respectful. They've been roommates together in Greenwich Village. So it's a much more complicated world. Didn't you get that sense too, Claire?
Absolutely.
You're talking about the Buckley's world is small in one sense, but capacious in another. They know everybody, right? And even the adversaries. Norman Mailer is riding his motorcycle out to Buckley's house. And, they're just encountering each other all the time. And no one would ever say, that's a world we want to recreate. I mean, it was very narrow. It was very privileged. It was very white. It was very waspy. But within that universe, it's like reading a novel by Evelyn Waugh or somebody. You kind of feel that there's a familial quality, even to the disputes and spats. And so it makes for a somewhat warmer universe, I think.
And I think the ways in which people continue to talk, and of course Buckley's great art was talk. I mean, he was a writer, but on a certain level, I never felt like he took writing as seriously as he took his performances. Some of his writing was good, some of it was not very good. Some of it was done far too quickly. Sometimes that method produced something that was a splash, but that people continue to talk to each other. And it's one of the things I thought about today. No one really speaks to each other if they disagree, or those disagreements are so fragile and delicate. People talk about not having family over for dinner because they disagree, and that's better than disagreeing. And I think Buckley would utterly disagree with that premise that people should stop talking because their ideas are so at odds with each other. But I want to ask you the question that I always ask at the end of these interviews, so it indicates we're drawing it to a close, which is, why should our listeners read this book now?
Well, I mean, I'm hard pressed to say why anyone should read anything I wrote. But what I'll say is, set aside the politics. Politics is very important, and it's very much a book about politics. It's also about literary life, cultural life. He led one of the most interesting American lives at a time when many Americans, no matter what their disadvantages were or obstacles faced them, believed there was endless possibility in America. I have two epigraphs in the book. I almost chose a third one, Claire, from The Great Gatsby, where early on, Nick Carraway is describing Gatsby. He said, you cannot be a more flawed figure than this man. The man's a criminal. He said, but he had a capacity for hope. He said he had a kind of sensitivity, he says, like a seismograph machine that registers changes in feeling and in the landscape of his society and the world. And it's because he has a boundless belief in the future, kind of optimism. That's what we lack now. Buckley really thought he could change the world and bring people around to his point of view through charm and grace and humor and wit. And he screwed up a lot and he did bad things. And he went to church and pleaded for forgiveness, always enlarged the circle of his friends whenever he could. One of the reasons I decided to write about him was when I was working on the biography of Whittaker Chambers and just getting to know him, and I was nobody from nowhere at that point. Listen, now I say I've since widened the swath of my anonymity, but at that point I was nobody from nowhere. And Buckley in 1990 was about as famous as a non-president could be in this culture. And he was always calling me to see how the book was coming along. He decided he was going to open doors for me and unlock gates. And at one point I told him, this is the biography of Whittaker Chambers. I'm not doing Buckley yet. And I was really hoping to get an interview with one of my idols, Gary Wills, the great writer and historian and thinker, and now lapsed Catholic. And I'd seen that Wills had a tantalizing reference to Whittaker Chambers in a memoir Wills wrote called Confessions of a Conservative. It was published in 1979, after Wills had left the movement, but is still personally attached, emotionally attached to his friends there. And I wrote to Wills, and this is in the days, I'm afraid you probably remember them too, when you typed up a letter and put it in an envelope and stuck it in the mail and hoped you'd hear from somebody. And I didn't get an answer. And I mentioned it to Buckley, and the phone rings, and it's Buckley, and he said, I hadn't spoken to Gary Wills in 20 years, but now he's by his phone waiting to hear from you.
Wow.
Which meant, after all their disagreements on Vietnam and the Berrigan brothers and Dr. King and civil rights and feminism, Wills was one of the first men who really embraced the feminist movement, partly through his wife, whom he esteemed, Natalie, whom I got to know. He was also willing to do something Bill Buckley asked him to do, and I also realized Buckley had been waiting for an opportunity to speak again with Wills. He didn't want to be estranged from him.
Yep.
He wanted him to be a friend. And my book on Whittaker Chambers was the pretext he needed, but also something that mattered to Buckley, that he should take an interest in what I'm doing when I'm really, just starting out. It just made me see how large a figure he was. People who are interested in reading about a really large life at a time when so many of our lives seem to shrink and shrivel in just the ways you're describing. If you're interested in seeing a really big, sweeping life, I think my book will give you that.
I think it will too. Sam Tanenhaus, thank you so much for coming on the show.
What a pleasure, Claire. Really enjoyed it.
And that's it for today's show. Thanks for hanging out with us. Share this podcast with a friend who loves history, politics, and smart conversation. You can follow Neil and me on Threads, Blue Sky, X, TikTok, and Instagram. Go to the Political Junkie Substack at clairepotter.substack.com for show notes, more episodes, to leave a comment or question, to subscribe for free, or to support our work for as little as $5 a month. You can also use links on our site to subscribe for free on your favorite podcast platform. If you do, please leave a rating and a comment so that other listeners can find us. This podcast is supported by the New School for Social Research and by Political Junkies paying subscribers. Consider becoming one of them. The episode was written, recorded, edited, and produced by me, Claire Potter. Today's theme is False Banners by Wicked Cinema. You can find their work and all the talented artists we feature on these episodes on Soundstripe. That's all for now. See you next week.